Imagine standing in a candlelit corridor of an imperial palace, thick with the scent of blood incense and betrayal. You hear a mother's scream, echoing off marble walls. Moments ago, her son, the Emperor of Rome, stabbed her other son to death. Not in battle, not in secret, but right before her eyes as she begged him to stop. His name was Caracalla, and his thirst for power would drown Rome in horror. This wasn't just another Roman succession story, it was a descent into madness. After killing his brother, Caracalla unleashed a reign of terror so cruel, so depraved, that even his allies shuddered. He didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted to own its soul. And he'd burn the world to do it. This is not a story of emperors. This is a story of fratricide, paranoia, and bloodlust. A mother's heartbreak, a brother's final gasp, and a city that watched it all with trembling fear. Welcome to the darkest chapter in Roman history. Imagine the imperial palace at dusk, Rome's heart beating behind walls of polished stone, its corridors echoing with whispers and footsteps too quiet to be innocent. The air is perfumed with incense, but beneath it lingers something fouler: sweat, fear, anticipation. In a room dimly lit by flickering oil lamps, the Empress Julia Domna stands between her sons, two men raised from birth to rule the world, now circling each other like wolves. Caracalla, the elder, stares across the chamber with hollow eyes, his jaw-clenched fingers twitching as if gripping an invisible dagger. Geta, his younger brother, tries to maintain composure, but there's a tremor in his voice, a stiffness in his spine. Julia pleads with them. "The empire is fragile," she says. "Their father is dead and Rome needs unity." She thinks this meeting is a step toward peace. She doesn't realize she's been lured into a slaughterhouse. Without warning, soldiers rush in men Caracalla stationed just beyond the door. They seize Geta. Julia screams and throws herself between them, but it's too late. Blades flash. Geta gasps as steel opens his flesh blood, blooming across his tunic like spilled wine. He collapses into his mother's arms, eyes wide in disbelief, blood pooling on the marble floor, staining her dress crimson. Caracalla doesn't flinch, doesn't speak. He watches with dead calm as his brother dies less than a foot away, their mother cradling the body like a broken doll. She wails, not just for her son, but for the death of her family, her future, her soul. And Caracalla walks out. He doesn't look back. This is not legend. This is fact. Rome, the eternal city, once knelt before emperors, but that night it trembled before a fratricide. The man now wearing the purple had just killed his only brother in front of their mother. Not out of desperation, not out of self-defense, but because the throne wasn't wide enough for two, and Caracalla wanted it all. But Geta's murder was not the climax. It was the spark. What followed would make even the blood-soaked reigns of Caligula and Nero seem measured. For Caracalla was not merely a killer. He was a butcher with an empire as his playground, and Rome, once the light of the world, would drown in the darkness of his vengeance. To understand what led to this horror, we must go back not just to the days of their childhood, but to the twisted family tree they grew from. A dynasty built on war treachery and the illusion of shared power. Because Caracalla's madness wasn't born in a single moment. It was nurtured, fed, and crowned. And it all began with a father's fatal mistake, believing that two brothers could rule Rome together. Caracalla and Geta were not born into peace, they were born into calculation. Their father, Septimius Severus, wasn't a man of compromise. He clawed his way to the imperial throne through blood and brilliance, a North African general who understood that power wasn't inherited, it was seized. When he took control of Rome in the chaos following Commodus and the Year of the Five Emperors, he did so by promising stability. But what he built instead was a legacy of fear. His marriage to Julia Domna was one of politics, intellect, and mutual ambition. Julia, a Syrian noblewoman from the city of Emesa, was brilliant, commanding, and deeply involved in state affairs. She surrounded herself with philosophers and scholars, but never turned her back on the raw mechanics of power. She was not a passive empress. She was a force, a woman revered by many and feared by even more. When Caracalla and Geta were born, they were not raised as brothers. They were trained as weapons. From the earliest days, they were told they were destined to rule the world. But no empire can truly belong to two men, and the boys understood that long before they wore their first togas. Caracalla, named after a Gallic cloak he loved, was fiery, impulsive, and violent. As a child, he enjoyed watching animals fight to the death. He'd mimic his father's scowl and once tried to order a servant whipped for looking at him the wrong way. He was ambitious, and more than that, he was insecure, desperate to prove himself the rightful heir. Geta, on the other hand, was softer in appearance, but sharper in mind. He was quiet, measured, and had a gift for oratory. Where Caracalla demanded loyalty through terror, Geta earned affection with charisma. Their rivalry fermented under the eyes of an empire. Even before Severus's death, the court was split. Senators whispered allegiance to one son or the other. Advisors played both sides. It became a game of veiled insults and unspoken threats. And Julia Domna, caught between the sons she loved and the legacy she tried to protect, tried to hold them together with the force of her will. In 198, Caracalla was declared Augustus by his father. Geta, still a boy, was named Caesar, subordinate, a shadow trailing behind. It was a wound that would fester for years. Eventually, Severus tried to patch the growing divide by elevating Geta to equal rank, but the damage had already been done. By the time Severus lay dying in 211 in York, he gave his sons one final damning piece of advice. Be harmonious with each other, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others. He might as well have told them to slit each other's throats. After Severus's death, Caracalla and Geta returned to Rome as co-emperors. But what should have been a shared triumph became a silent civil war. They divided the palace with guards. They refused to dine together. They refused to speak. Servants were beaten for delivering messages from one brother to the other. Senators had to choose their words carefully. Favoring the wrong emperor could mean exile or execution. And Julia Domna, still grieving her husband, now lived in a home cut in two. One son on each side. She moved between them like a ghost, trying to keep peace with diplomacy and tears. But she knew what was coming. Everyone did. It was no longer a matter of if, it was a matter of when. Caracalla made the first move. He spread rumors that Geta was plotting his assassination. He whispered in the ears of the Praetorian Guard. He framed Geta as a traitor, a coward, a danger to Rome. He offered bribes to key officials and exiled those who questioned his narrative. The imperial propaganda machine turned its gears slowly but deliberately. But even Caracalla knew one thing: he couldn't kill Geta in open daylight. The people loved Geta. Many in the Senate supported him. A public execution would spark riots. He needed to destroy him without blame, without warning. So he offered peace. He sent a message to Geta offering reconciliation in the presence of their mother. Julia, desperate and exhausted, believed him. She arranged the meeting in a private room of the palace. The brothers would come unarmed, no guards, only Julia, only family. But Caracalla never intended peace. He hid his soldiers just beyond the threshold. As Geta stepped into the chamber, arms open, perhaps even hopeful, Caracalla gave the signal. Steel pierced flesh. Blood soaked the floor. Julia Domna wailed as her son died in her arms. This was the final act of a lifelong rivalry, but the first act of something much darker. Caracalla did not mourn. He did not hesitate. In that moment, he believed himself unstoppable. The empire was his. His brother was dead. His mother was broken. But death is not the end of fear. Sometimes it is only the door. And Caracalla, now unopposed, was about to unleash something Rome had never seen before. Not just a tyranny, not just murder, something worse. Geta's body was scarcely cold before the empire began to bleed. Caracalla moved swiftly, not to hide the murder, but to sanctify it. He stormed into the Senate and declared that Geta had plotted treason, that he had no choice but to strike first. It was a lie so bald, so brutal, that it barely passed his theater. But the Senate applauded anyway. They had seen emperors kill before. They knew the script. Silence meant survival. But Caracalla wasn't interested in merely rewriting history. He wanted to annihilate it. He ordered a damnatio memoriae against his brother, the most complete erasure the Roman state could inflict. Geta's face was scraped from coins, his name chiseled off monuments. Scrolls containing his decrees were burned. Even portraits in private homes were ripped from walls and destroyed. To speak his name became a death sentence. Rome had seen emperors erase their enemies, but this was something deeper, something obsessive. It wasn't political, it was personal. And then came the blood. Over 20,000 people were executed in the wake of Geta's death. Not generals, not soldiers, not enemies of the state. These were senators who had shown him favor, friends, secretaries, tutors, servants, guards, midwives who had once cradled him, astrologers who had read him a promising future. Even children were not spared. Anyone related by blood or loyalty was seen as a threat. Whole households disappeared in the night. Streets ran red as Caracalla's men dragged victims from their beds. Some begged for mercy. Others cursed his name. None were spared. In the Palatine Hill, once a sanctuary of elegance, executions became routine. Beheadings in the garden, strangulations in the baths, mothers forced to watch their children die before being butchered themselves. Caracalla had turned the palace into a charnel house. Julia Domna, once the beating heart of the imperial family, now moved through the corridors like a specter. Her grief was so great, so consuming, that she reportedly refused food for days, but she dared not mourn openly. Her son, the murderer of her other child, now ruled alone. She stood by his side in public, her expression carved from stone, her spirit locked behind her eyes. Even she could not stop what came next. The purges reached into the streets. Citizens who merely wept for Geta were accused of treason. One elderly woman overheard whispering Geta's name in prayer was dragged to the forum and whipped to death in front of a crowd. A young boy caught scribbling Geta's face on a wax tablet was crucified outside the city gates. Caracalla wanted not only to kill Geta's memory, but to punish anyone who dared remember him. Survivors learned to perform their fear. They shouted Caracalla's praises in the streets, knelt when his name was spoken, and cursed Geta with practiced venom. They called it the new loyalty, but it was just another kind of death. Senators lived in terror. Spies were everywhere. A slip of the tongue, a misplaced look, an old friendship could mean dismemberment. Caracalla ruled not through laws or armies, but through dread. Fear had always been a tool of emperors, but under Caracalla it became the law itself. The Praetorian Guard, once protectors of the emperor, became his private death squad. Their loyalty was bought with gold and soaked in blood. Caracalla raised their pay, lavished them with gifts, and demanded their worship. In return, they acted with impunity. Rape, robbery, and murder became common, even celebrated. There were no rules anymore, only survival. Caracalla didn't just purge people. He purged identity. Rome had long been a city of God's law and memory. Under Caracalla, those things crumbled. He built no grand temples to the divine. He built shrines to himself. Where statues of Mars once stood, now there were statues of Caracalla, glorified, exaggerated eyes gazing into oblivion. He spoke not of Rome, but of destiny. His destiny. His greatness. His paranoia grew with each passing week. He began accusing his own advisors of betrayal. Some were executed, others imprisoned without trial. He started changing residences in the middle of the night, convinced that assassins lurked in every corridor. Guards were rotated hourly. Food was tested 3 times before it touched his lips. He stopped trusting mirrors. He claimed Geta's spirit haunted him, but still he did not stop. The killing never stopped. Rome became a different city. A darker one. Gone were the orators in the forum, the laughter in the baths, the bustling night markets. Now there were whispers, silence. Doors shut early, windows shuttered, temple offerings tripled in desperation. Sacrifices increased not to honor the gods, but to protect against madness. And in the center of it all, Caracalla sat on a throne, drenched in blood, convinced he was the victim convinced the world owed him loyalty for surviving his brother's betrayal. Every death was a confirmation, every scream a lullaby. This was no longer the story of an emperor. It was the unraveling of a mind that would soon tear not only Rome, but the entire empire apart. And the worst, unimaginably, was yet to come. When a man kills his brother in front of their mother, you might think he's reached the limits of cruelty. But Caracalla was only warming up. The murder of Geta didn't satisfy his hunger, it sharpened it. Something shifted inside him that day, something final. If there was ever a line between man and monster, Caracalla had crossed it and never looked back. He began to see himself not just as emperor, but as a god among mortals. Obsessed with greatness, he fixated on Alexander the Great, the boy king who had conquered the known world. Caracalla studied him, mimicked him, dressed like him. He adopted Macedonian military garb, surrounded himself with Greek soldiers, and forced his courtiers to refer to him in divine terms. He would stand for hours in front of Alexander's statues, whispering to them like they were living things. He started commissioning art and coins depicting himself as Hercules, Mars, and even Serapis, a strange fusion of Greek and Egyptian deities. He wasn't satisfied with ruling Rome. He wanted to embody every myth, every conqueror, every god who had ever been feared. And anyone who doubted this vision, who failed to worship him with trembling devotion, was marked. His court became a palace of silence. Servants were forbidden to look him in the eye. Ministers learned to speak in cryptic praise, careful never to contradict or even hesitate in front of him. Several were executed simply for disagreeing with a military suggestion. One general was burned alive after Caracalla overheard him telling a joke about bald men, an obvious jab at the emperor's own thinning hair. And Julia Domna. She was still there, still trying to play the role of mother and empress, but she was fading. Her eyes, once sharp with calculation, now wandered. Some said she spoke to the shadows. Others said she kept Geta's blood-stained tunic in a locked chest in her chamber. Caracalla no longer trusted her, yet couldn't let her go. She was the last thread tying him to a version of himself that still resembled human. Meanwhile, Rome began to suffer under the crushing weight of his instability. Caracalla launched a massive public relations campaign, but it was grotesque in scope. He declared the Constitutio Antoniniana, a decree granting Roman citizenship to all free men within the empire. At first glance, it seemed like a generous act of unity, but in reality, it was a tax ploy. Citizenship came with financial obligations. Caracalla was draining the treasury with gifts to the army and construction of monuments to himself. He needed income, so he sold the illusion of equality and used the proceeds to fund more terror. His paranoia deepened. He slept in different chambers each night. Food tasters were poisoned on suspicion alone. He had guards executed for yawning too loudly near him, claiming it was a bad omen. He carried a dagger at all times and sometimes wandered the palace in armor, whispering to himself in Greek. He believed Geta was haunting him. He spoke of dreams in which his brother emerged from rivers of blood eyes, hollow mouth, dripping poison. When he traveled outside Rome, he brought fear with him like a cloak. In the city of Antioch, he had a dream that a local priest insulted his honor. The next morning, that priest's entire temple was burned, and its attendants were impaled along the city walls. In Gaul, he accused a local governor of conspiring with spirits to curse him. The man and his family were buried alive. Caracalla watched in silence. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted reverence. He wanted love born of terror. One of his most disturbing acts came when he began hosting secret banquets, at night private affairs with select guests. These were not feasts, but staged performances. Caracalla would sit on a raised throne while prisoners were brought in, forced to fight to the death before him. Their blood was spilled on imported white marble floors, specially polished to reflect the carnage. He called them offerings to Mars. Guests were forbidden from looking away. The palace staff who cleaned these rooms afterward were never seen again. And yet in public he still maintained the veneer of a ruler. He toured cities, he kissed children, he built roads and offered gifts. But behind that thin veil was a rotting mind. He would burst into violent rages during council meetings. He once ripped out the beard of a senator mid-conversation. Another time he walked into a courtroom, declared everyone inside guilty of treason, and ordered them hanged. No trial, no explanation. The people of Rome began to live like prey alert quiet, always listening. The city grew hushed. Religious festivals were canceled. Theaters closed. Statues were covered in veils as if the gods themselves could no longer watch. Some claim they saw a change in the sky, red moon stars that trembled birds that dropped from the heavens mid-flight. Rome was not just afraid, it was cursed, and in the center of this curse was Caracalla, Emperor fratricide madman. He had killed his brother, he had broken his mother, and now he was carving open the very soul of the empire. But Caracalla wasn't done. He believed he could save himself, if not through sanity, then through conquest. And so he turned his gaze beyond Rome. If he couldn't kill the ghost inside him, maybe he could drown it in foreign blood. What followed would stretch his madness across continents and leave entire cities smoldering in his wake. By now, Rome was no longer a city of law. It was a city of eyes watching, waiting, weeping in silence. Under Caracalla, fear was not just a consequence of tyranny. It was the method of governance itself. The emperor didn't just want to be obeyed. He wanted to infect every home, every temple, every heartbeat with the terror of his name. Even the simplest acts, laughing too loudly, looking uncertain, hesitating to kneel, were risks. People learned to school their expressions to rehearse the praises they would recite should the emperor pass by. Children were taught to denounce their parents if they heard any whisper of doubt. Paranoia wasn't a symptom, it was survival. Caracalla had made Rome into a crucible. He fed the fire daily. The streets were quieter now. Once vendors had cried out the prices of figs and wine. Poets had debated in the shadow of the forum. Musicians strummed lutes in the gardens. Now the only regular sounds were the clicking of armored boots and the thud of doors being shut early in the evening. The people had learned when the Praetorian Guard moved through the streets, it was never for protection. It was for collection. Public executions were scheduled with chilling precision. Victims were marched to the Forum or the Circus Maximus, tied to stakes and left for the crowd to witness. Sometimes they were accused of treason, sometimes of blasphemy, sometimes of nothing at all. A senator who failed to greet Caracalla with sufficient enthusiasm was skinned alive. His family was forced to watch. A child who cried during a public ceremony was thrown into the Tiber. Caracalla didn't hide these acts. He celebrated them. He claimed it was Rome's duty to remain strong and pure, to cleanse itself of weakness. And so he painted butchery as patriotism. Anyone who mourned was suspect. Anyone who remembered Geta was guilty. The people learned to cheer while they vomited in secret, and still they paid. To fund his military bribes and egomaniacal building projects, Caracalla raised taxes to crushing levels. He enacted fines for previously minor offenses, late payments, unpaid tributes, even improper dress. He sent tax collectors into temples and seized sacred offerings. When city treasuries ran dry, he confiscated land and sold it to foreign mercenaries. The aristocracy suffered most visibly. Ancient families, proud patricians who traced their lineage back to the founding of the Republic, were bankrupted overnight. Their villas were stripped of marble, their statues decapitated. Some fled to the countryside. Others took their own lives rather than be dragged through the streets as criminals. But the poor did not escape. Caracalla's citizenship decree, once seen as a revolutionary gesture of inclusion, now revealed its true purpose. Every man in the empire was now subject to Roman tax law. Bakers, farmers, weavers all found themselves crushed under impossible burdens. Some tried to run. Caracalla sent troops after them. And yet through it all the emperor's cult of personality deepened. He ordered massive statues of himself erected in every major city. He stood 30 feet tall in bronze, arm raised in eternal victory, eyes cast downward in icy judgment. Priests were instructed to offer daily sacrifices in his honor. Children were made to recite hymns, praising his divine genius before lessons. Caracalla had become his own religion. He even created a new festival, the Dies Antoniniani, a day of celebration dedicated solely to himself. It was a spectacle of excess forced parades, theatrical murders disguised as gladiator games, grotesque feasts where roasted animals were served with gold leaf and blood-red wine. The people attended because they had to, but they did not celebrate. They watched, they endured. Behind closed doors, whispers grew bolder. Some called him the Crimson God. Others called him the Walking Curse. One merchant scrawled a message in charcoal on the wall of a latrine: better to dine with Hades than share bread with Caracalla. He was found a week later nailed to the floor of his own bakery, his mouth stuffed with blackened bread. In the Senate, compliance was absolute. Senators rose to their feet the moment Caracalla's name was spoken. They voted in favor of every edict without debate. When he entered the chamber flanked by armored guards and wearing the garb of Alexander, they bowed as if before Jupiter himself. None of them had forgotten what had happened to those who doubted him. Heads had rolled. Families had disappeared. The marble steps were still stained with old blood. Even the gods seemed silent. Temples were empty. Sacrifices increased, but omens grew darker. Lightning struck the capital 3 times in 1 month. A comet appeared above the Palatine Hill. A sheep was born with 2 heads in Latium. The people whispered that the gods had abandoned Rome, or worse, that Caracalla had taken their place. Julia Domna remained at his side, but barely. Some said she no longer spoke. Others said she had gone mad, convinced that Geta still walked the halls at night. Whether out of love or fear, she stayed. But her presence, once a calming force, now only deepened the palace's air of dread. She was a reminder of what had been lost, of what had been murdered. And through all this, Caracalla smiled. He believed himself invincible. He believed he had forged a stronger Rome, one purified by pain, one united by terror. But his hands, though gilded with rings and kissed by the desperate, were stained past cleansing. The city he ruled was hollow, beautiful but dead inside. A wax mask stretched over a rotting skull. Still, Caracalla wanted more. His appetite had only grown. Rome had been punished. Now the rest of the world would feel his wrath. He would ride beyond the empire's borders. He would conquer. He would cleanse. He would kill until the ghosts in his mind were silent. The blood of a city was not enough. He wanted an empire to burn. Caracalla left Rome with the wind at his back and blood in his wake. He called it a military campaign, a chance to expand the empire's glory, but it was nothing more than a moving slaughter. What he truly sought was not conquest. It was catharsis. He wanted to kill until the whispers stopped, until Geta's ghost no longer visited his dreams, until the world bent beneath his will. His first destination was the east. In 215 AD, Caracalla arrived in Alexandria, Egypt, a city of light learning and legacy. Its libraries were world-renowned. Its streets pulsed with intellect and defiance. And Caracalla despised it. The Alexandrians mocked him behind closed doors, clever biting satire plays with thinly veiled jokes, whispered songs mocking the brother killer. Word reached the emperor. It always did. Caracalla responded with diplomacy at first. He offered games, parades, bread for the masses. He walked through the streets, smiling like a god among men, extending his hands in blessing. Then he ordered a massacre. Under the guise of inviting young citizens to a military review, he gathered thousands into the hippodrome. The gates were sealed. Then the soldiers began their work. Swords, spears, axes, no one was spared. Scholars, scribes, children. Blood turned the sand to mud. Screams rose into the blue Egyptian sky and did not stop for hours. By nightfall, the Nile ran red. Tens of thousands were dead, not as punishment, not as warning, but as pleasure. Caracalla reportedly watched from a balcony drinking wine, his face impassive. Some said he whispered Geta's name as the bodies fell. The massacre at Alexandria shocked even the most hardened veterans of the empire. But Caracalla wasn't done. He turned east toward Parthia. He had always dreamed of repeating Alexander the Great's legendary campaigns. But unlike Alexander, Caracalla was no strategist. He didn't seek territory. He sought vengeance for slights, real or imagined. In Parthia, he requested a royal marriage to the daughter of the Parthian king, Artabanus IV. It was a pretext. When the king refused, Caracalla declared war. But this was not a war in the Roman sense, measured battles, clear objectives. Caracalla unleashed fire. Villages were burned. Wells were poisoned. Civilians were crucified along roadsides as warnings. He slaughtered livestock, razed temples, and left fields salted. He didn't care about Parthia's riches or borders. He wanted to destroy a civilization for denying him a bride. Entire towns were wiped out. In Arbela, Roman soldiers massacred thousands in a single night. Women were dragged from their homes and beaten to death. Infants were impaled on pikes and left at city gates. Caracalla called it justice. Soldiers once loyal to him began to fear his presence. He changed orders constantly. He accused his own commanders of cowardice and had them executed for imagined failures. At one point, he claimed a divine vision had instructed him to punish all cities that had not offered him statues. Dozens of settlements were looted, their populations erased. He slept in a different tent each night, not because of strategy, but because he believed Geta's soul was hunting him. He demanded priests from across the empire to perform rituals of protection. He began wearing talismans sewn into his tunics. His paranoia infected everything. Some claimed he drank bull's blood for protection. Others said he bathed in the blood of enemies to cleanse himself. In Antioch, after another whispered insult, he ordered an entire theater audience rounded up. Hundreds were killed. Those who survived were made to drag the corpses to mass graves before being executed themselves. He named it a cleansing ceremony. His advisors no longer spoke. His generals no longer strategized. They obeyed in silence, knowing that to speak, to question, to breathe wrong was to die. Caracalla ruled from horseback, his armor permanently stained with sweat, and old gore, his eyes bloodshot and bulging. He didn't just look like a madman, he had become something worse, something primal. Meanwhile, word reached Rome. The Senate as always responded with terror and praise. They declared his victories glorious. They offered sacrifices in his name. They sent golden statues. But behind closed doors they whispered prayers for his death. Even they who had watched Nero burn his city knew this was something far darker. Caracalla's own men began to unravel. The soldiers once loyal now feared his every order. One day he praised a centurion for his courage in battle. The next he had him flayed alive for arrogant posture. Morale plummeted. Desertions increased. Mutinies brewed beneath the surface. But Caracalla could not stop. He had convinced himself that destiny called that he must follow Alexander's path to the ends of the world. He planned to march on Babylon to push beyond the Parthian frontier, to claim all of Mesopotamia for Rome. But the further he rode, the deeper he descended. He began to lose time. He spoke of voices in the wind. He said he could see Geta's face in the stars. He ordered soldiers to kneel and swear they did not dream of his brother. He wept openly, then laughed without reason. One night he ordered a camp's entire night watch executed after a single owl landed near his tent. There was no empire left in him, only ghosts, only rage. And yet for all his cruelty, Caracalla still believed he could control his fate. That his sword would silence the screams in his mind, that conquest would finally make him whole. But in the shadows of his own camp, other whispers had begun. Whispers not of fear, but of plans, of betrayal, of steel in the dark. Caracalla would not die in battle. He would die like the thing he had become, a hunted animal. Caracalla's shadow loomed over the empire like a sickness. Wherever he rode, cities withered and men whispered prayers under their breath. But even a mad god cannot outrun the blade. His end would come not from an enemy's sword in the field, but from something far colder, from the very men who once swore to protect him. In 217 AD, Caracalla was in Mesopotamia, preparing yet another campaign against the Parthians. His mind was unraveling fast. He slept poorly, tormented by dreams of Geta's face floating above his bed, eyes, hollow mouth sewn shut. He had stopped trusting even his most loyal generals. Execution lists grew longer with each passing day. No one, not even those closest to him, felt safe. The Praetorian Guard had had enough. Among them was a man named Marcus Opellius Macrinus, an equestrian from Mauritania, who had risen through the ranks to become Praetorian Prefect, one of the highest positions in the empire. Outwardly loyal, Macrinus was a cautious, calculating man. And he knew something no one else did: a prophecy. An oracle had recently declared that he who slays the lion shall become emperor. Caracalla, paranoid to the bone, interpreted it as a warning one of his generals, someone close, would betray him. He began to suspect Macrinus. The air grew colder around them. One slip, one wrong glance, and Macrinus knew he'd joined the growing heap of corpses that paved the emperor's path. So he acted first. He arranged the plan with surgical precision. While Caracalla traveled north near Carrhae in modern-day Turkey, Macrinus enlisted a soldier named Justinus, a man Caracalla had once humiliated in public for minor negligence. The emperor had laughed as Justinus was flogged. Now that laughter would cost him his life. April 8th, 217. Caracalla rode out of his camp on horseback with a small escort stopping along the road to relieve himself a moment of privacy in a world of paranoia. Justinus approached under the guise of duty, perhaps to report something trivial. Caracalla barely looked up. And then the knife came. One thrust to the side, a second to the back. Caracalla collapsed into the dust, his eyes wide, not with fear but disbelief. He tried to speak, but the blood rising in his throat smothered the words. The emperor who had burned cities, murdered children, butchered his own brother, died in the dirt, his lifeblood soaking into the earth he had once claimed as his own. No soldiers rushed to save him. No one screamed. His escort stood still, not out of shock, but out of silent agreement. It was over. When the body was returned to the camp, few wept. Most remained expressionless. A few even smiled. Macrinus moved quickly. He declared Caracalla's death a divine act, just retribution for crimes against the gods. He was proclaimed emperor by the army within hours. The Senate, ever opportunistic, confirmed him without hesitation. Caracalla's statues were quietly dismantled. His face was scratched from coins. No grand funeral, no eulogies, just silence. Caracalla's reign had lasted 6 years. 6 years of terror, paranoia, and unrelenting blood. He left no heir, no dynasty, only scars. Julia Domna, still in Antioch at the time, received the news days later. Her son, the last of her bloodline, murdered by his own men. The details were kept from her, some say out of mercy, others say because no one dared speak the truth aloud. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply stopped eating. Refusing food or water, she locked herself in her chamber. For days she lay in silence, surrounded by memories. Geta's robe, a broken statue of Septimius, letters burned to ash in the brazier. Some say she whispered their names. Others say she cursed them all. Julia Domna died of starvation and grief. The woman who had been the backbone of an empire, the empress who had survived war court intrigue and unspeakable loss, chose to follow her sons into death. And so, with Caracalla's corpse rotting in a shallow grave, and Julia Domna's body laid on a pyre without ceremony, the Severan dynasty collapsed into ruin. But Caracalla's legacy could not be buried so easily. He had redefined what it meant to rule through fear. His policies, his purges, his madness left wounds across the empire that festered long after his death. Provinces rose in rebellion. Economies faltered. Trust in the emperorship itself began to rot. He was not remembered as a builder or a leader or even a warrior. He was remembered as a warning. A man who killed his brother in front of their mother, then tried to rule an empire with the blood still wet on his hands. A man who sought to become a god and died like a beast, and yet even in death his shadow lingered. Because Caracalla had proven something terrible, that the Roman world, so proud of its laws and civilization, could still be ruled by a monster if that monster wore the right crown. Caracalla was dead, but Rome was far from healed. His reign had not just spilled blood, it had poisoned the roots of the empire. After his assassination, the empire stumbled forward like a man with a dagger still lodged in his ribs. The wounds were deep: an exhausted army, a bankrupt treasury, a population terrified into silence. And in the center of it all, the haunting absence of a dynasty that had imploded from within. Macrinus, the man who ordered Caracalla's death, became emperor, the first to rise from the equestrian class rather than the senatorial elite. But his reign was short-lived. He lacked legitimacy, charisma, and the trust of the soldiers. He tried to undo Caracalla's policies to calm the storm, but it was too late. The army had tasted chaos. The court had been trained in fear. The people no longer knew who to believe. Within a year, Macrinus was killed by a rival claimant, a teenager backed by the Severan family. The cycle of blood continued. Rome had always survived its emperors. It had outlived Caligula, Nero, Commodus. But Caracalla left something different behind. Not just a broken empire, but a blueprint for power without morality. He had taught future rulers that murder could be law, that paranoia could be policy, that if you kill boldly enough, people will forget to resist. In the years that followed, emperors would come and go like flickering flames, many of them burning out in blood and betrayal. Civil wars erupted. Provinces rebelled. The empire began to tear at its seams. Historians would later call it the crisis of the 3rd century. But Caracalla was the warning bell. He had shown Rome what happens when the throne becomes a mirror for madness. Even today, his story feels unreal, like a myth, a nightmare whispered across centuries. But it was real. The palace corridors soaked with blood. A mother screaming over her son's corpse. Citizens executed for tears, scholars butchered in the streets of Alexandria, an emperor haunted by the brother he murdered. Caracalla wasn't a monster in legend. He was a man. And that makes it all the more terrifying. If this story disturbed you, it should. The Roman Empire was not just marble columns and togas, it was built on bone and fear. And Caracalla's reign was its darkest reflection. If you want more stories like this of rulers who lost their souls, of empires built on silence, and of power pushed beyond the edge of sanity, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone who thinks history is just dates and battles. What happened in Rome was real, and if we're not careful, the past has a way of repeating itself. Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's carved into stone. By the blade, by the